Somewhere in the Andes, 16 men walked off a mountainside that the world had already declared their grave. For 72 days, no one knew they were alive. To endure, they made a choice that still divides opinion, a decision ensuring those still alive would not be added to the count of the dead. On October 12, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 took off with 45 people on board. Most were members of the Old Christians rugby team, traveling for a match in Chile. They were students and friends in their early 20s, with no training in mountaineering or winter survival. Standing between them and their destination was the Andes, the longest continental mountain range on Earth. Many of these peaks exceed 20,000 feet, looming directly over a flight path that gave the pilots very little room for error. The group was flying into a geography they weren't prepared for, in a plane that struggled with the altitude. When the weather turned, the amateur status of the passengers and the scale of the mountains left them with no margin of safety. Flying through heavy cloud cover, the pilots lost their bearings. They believed they had already cleared the mountains and began their descent early, steering the aircraft directly into the hidden ridges. At 3:30 p.m., the plane's right wing struck a mountain ridge at 11,500 feet. The impact tore the wing away and sheared off the tail section, falling several passengers into the open air as the fuselage began to fall. The remains of the fuselage slammed into a steep slope and slid nearly 400 meters before coming to a halt in the Valley of Tears. Of the 45 people on board, 12 were killed in the crash. 33 remained. They were alive, but they were stranded in a freezing, high-altitude environment. They had no winter gear, no medical supplies, and no way to call help. The survivors were now trapped in a place where the conditions themselves were lethal. During the first week, temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The survivors were forced to use seat cushions for warmth and scavenge what they could for food, which amounted to only a few bars of chocolate and some wine for over 30 people. On day 8, they managed to hear a broadcast on a small transistor radio recovered from the wreckage. The news was devastating. Because the white plane was invisible against the snow, the search had been officially called off. The world assumed they were dead. Then, on the 16th night, an avalanche swept down the mountain and buried the fuselage while the group slept inside. It killed 8 more people, leaving only 27 survivors trapped beneath the snow. Between the radio silence and the avalanche, the survivors realized their isolation was absolute. No one was coming. If they were going to live, the solution had to come from within the group.
At this altitude, the human body burns energy significantly faster than at sea level, just to maintain a core temperature. With their meager supplies gone, their bodies were forced to consume their own muscle tissue. Without a new source of protein, they would all be dead within days. Facing this reality, the group entered a long, somber debate. They eventually reached a pact. If any of them died, the others had permission to use their bodies as food. They didn't view this as a choice between right and wrong, but as a necessity for life. Many framed it as a final gift from their friends, drawing a parallel to the religious tradition of communion to help process the weight of the decision. Modern ethicists often point to this as one of the most practical decisions ever made under the threat of death. It was a cold, logical response to an environment that offered no other way to survive. This decision gave them the energy they needed to keep going, but it didn't change the fact that they were still trapped. It bought them more days on the mountain, but they still needed a way to reach civilization. 2 months after the crash, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa decided to walk out. They used a makeshift sleeping bag sewn from plane insulation and began a trek to the west, hoping to find the valleys of Chile. After days of climbing, they reached a 17,000-foot summit. Instead of the green valleys they expected, they saw nothing but more mountains. The scale of the range was far greater than their maps or their pilots had suggested. They didn't turn back. For 10 days, they walked through the snow until the white landscape finally turned to earth and grass. Near a river, they finally spotted a Chilean cattle herder on the opposite bank. Through sheer physical persistence, Parrado and Canessa bridged the gap between the crash site and the rest of the world. They had finally found the edge of civilization. Because the river was too loud for shouting,
Parado tied a note to a rock and threw it across. It explained that they were from the plane that had crashed in the mountains and that 14 of their friends were still waiting for help. On December 22nd, 72 days after they first disappeared, helicopters reached the Valley of Tears. The 16 survivors were airlifted off the mountain, finally ending their ordeal. The survivors have spent the last 50 years speaking openly about what happened on that mountain. They remain a close group, linked by a shared history and the difficult choices they made together. What would you have done in their position? Their story isn't remembered as a tragedy, but as a study of what ordinary people are capable of when their lives depend on the person standing next to them.